Hello. So I'm humbled to introduce you to Professor Mojisola Adebayo. Is that how you pronounce it?
Mojisola.
Mojisola Adebayo.
Perfect.
All right,
Yeah.
okay. Hello. My name is Devashish Haldar. I'm a research scholar at the School of Drama and Fine Arts, University of Calicut. And I'm humbled today to introduce to you Professor Mojisola Adebayo, a playwright of paramount capacity, a theatre practitioner. She has worked as a facilitator, a professor at the Queen Mary University, and her PhD is in Black queer theory of theatre. Right? So, before we delve deeper into this conversation, I'd like to keep this conversation very candid with you. So, having intervened in this space of agroeconomy and relational dynamics of cultivation with colonialism, how did you transmute this entire relationality into your practice, and what got you thinking about this thing and thinking about devising a theory or a practical realm to it which would conduce the theatre practices to come forward?
Big question. I think it starts on a little boat off the coast of the Gambia, where I had taken a trip. I wanted to think about some things, wanted to think about making theatre. And I was particularly concerned with the climate crisis. This was over 20 years ago, when it was still a relatively kind of new thing that people were thinking about. But I was particularly concerned about the effect of the climate crisis on Africa and the global south, and people of African descent around the world and other peoples, but particularly thinking about Africa. And I was on this little boat, which was traveling over to a tiny island called James Island, which was a place where hundreds of thousands of African people were held in enslavement before being taken to the Americas. And they explained to me when we're going over to this little island that this little island is disappearing into the sea because of rising sea levels. And I thought, I want to make something that particularly looks at the history of enslavement and the way that the history of enslavement connects with the Industrial Revolution in Europe, and how the Industrial Revolution directly feeds the climate crisis, and how all of those things are interconnected. So I thought I want to do something about that, because the disappearance of this island where enslaved people were held seemed to encapsulate that. And I also had in the back of my mind this story, a story about an African-American enslaved woman who cross-dressed as a white man to escape slavery. And she got away with it, she did it. Her name was Ellen Craft. And I imagined her going all the way from the deep south in America, cross-dressed as a white man, up to the northern states, over to England, which is what she did. She got to England. But then I also imagined her then becoming a sailor on board a whaling ship and sailing all the way down to Antarctica. And in some way, I imagined that this story would somehow connect America, Africa, Antarctica, slavery, climate crisis, through this kind of odyssey. So I thought, that's my idea. And I had this idea on this little boat, and I got myself to Antarctica. It's a very long story. And I cross-dressed as a white man, painted my face white on Antarctica, wore mid-19th century costume on Antarctica, with an artist called Della Grace Volcano, who took the pictures. Came back from this incredible shoot, looked at the pictures, looked at the film, and wrote the play Moj of the Antarctic, which does this work of connecting colonialism, enslavement, the climate crisis, through this idea of melting identity, melting race, melting gender, melting ice, and how all of that relates to rising sea levels. So it sounds very convoluted, but somehow it works, and that's what started me thinking about racism and the climate crisis together. And I did some other work, and then I came back to it with Nicole Wolf, with doing these workshops where we started to think, how can we think about addressing the climate crisis through theatre, and in particular, how can we think about sharing knowledge, indigenous knowledge, black knowledge? How can we think about sharing knowledge, principles of agroecology, but through theatre? How can we do that, not just in a play, but in workshops? And so we started to develop this practice that we've been sharing here in Kerala, and have had the great honour of working with students and playing and experimenting with those ideas. So that incredible trip to Antarctica got me to these workshops in Kerala. So, yeah.
That's really interesting that... I would rather take this liberty to asking you this question, that when a lot of people would choose conformity and choose theatre in a direction which would be not this indulgent, not this exploring with the relational impacts of every form of oppression with one another and tracing back to history, right? What made you choose non-conformity? What made you choose intervention?
I think it comes a little bit from my anger and dissatisfaction and boredom really with theatre and with theatre training. And until I had the great opportunity of meeting somebody called Augusto Boal and doing some training with him in Theatre of the Oppressed and reading his book. And that's what sparked my thinking that theatre could be useful. Up until then, I thought theatre was pretty irrelevant, really. Classist, racist, sexist, kind of irrelevant. Very conforming, a tool of the oppressors. I was really not impressed. I had got into theatre because I had been rapping on the street. And for me, hip-hop and music was far more of an intervention than theatre was. But then I met Augusto Boal and read this book, Theatre of the Oppressed. And I thought to myself, theatre can be useful. So that's that early training about 30 years ago now is what has informed this latest work. And in fact, the workshops that Nicole and I have been doing very much blend games and exercises from Theatre of the Oppressed with thinking about agroecology together.
So in this whole relationality, how do you, methodologically, how do you look at exploring the politics of the body in relation to all these forms of oppression, and especially this dimension where cultivation or ecology or land distribution is directly linked with colonialism even after so many years, which must have precipitated deep inside our being, right?
Yeah.
So you go into finding the deep embodiment of these things, right, through your workshops. How does that work out? Like, what is the process? What is the foundation of that process?
We start with a lot of games and exercises that really enable us to make connection with each other and also to start to understand that everything is connected. So things that seem very disparate and disconnected, like mobile phones and the war in Congo, or floods in Kerala and floods in the north of England, or Black American life and South Asian life. Things that might seem very disparate and separate, we start to think about the interconnectivity of all of those things through the lens of colonialism and anti-colonialism. So through games and exercises. There's also a lot of people making images and people making their own images and images of their own oppression, things that oppress them and the ways in which they see oppression and in particular climate injustice in the world. So for example, with the workshop that we did just today, people were immediately able to reference climate injustice here in India and how we can see those things happening. And then we could start to make connections with each other, but that was through talking, but we also make images, and then we start making scenes as well, and start making scenes where people can intervene.
Right. So, this practice has also led you to writing 30 plays.
Not quite 30, but yeah, devising about 30 plays.
Devising about 30
and I've
plays.
written about 13 plays.
And all in relationality with various kinds of oppression, starting from colonialism to racism, to issues of gender, to issues of racialism. You wore an indirect intervention with your art in the whole movement of Black Lives Matter, right? So, how does looking at this as a playwright happen? Like, how do you intervene as a playwright?
Yeah, it's a great question. With the workshops with Nicole Wolf have very much informed one of my most recent plays, Family Tree, which again might seem like very disparate subjects, but actually will somehow come together. And the play Family Tree is, first of all, inspired by Henrietta Lacks, who was an African-American woman who lived in 1951, who at the age of 31 got a very aggressive form of cancer and sadly died, leaving behind her children. And nobody would know about her. She would have not a particularly remarkable life, although every individual is remarkable, but she wouldn't be famous now, or her fame wouldn't have been hidden, and it was hidden. Her importance was hidden. If it wasn't for the fact that when her cells were taken, when she died, in Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore in Maryland, cells were taken from her body. Cells were taken from the cancer in her body. And they discovered that these cells were immortal. They're the first immortal cell lines. So everybody listening to this interview, you and I, everybody who's ever taken any kind of formal kind of medication, anybody who's ever had a vaccine, medical treatment, everything, just about everything is tested on her cells. They're called the HeLa cells, after the first two letters of her first name and surname, HeLa, Henrietta Lacks. But the fact that she was a black woman was hidden from the world. She was even renamed Helen Lane to make her sound more white. But her cells continue to multiply and divide all over the world, in India, in Pakistan, in Britain, in every country in the world where there are cells. Her cells are there, dividing, and all medication is tested on her cells. So they are the immortal cell line. They're incredible cells. They're the most powerful cells in the world. Any biologist will tell you that. But they often won't talk about Henrietta Lacks and that she was a black woman. So this seemed to me to be about extraction. Extraction from her body, and that made me think of extraction from the land. Of course, she descended from enslaved peoples. Extraction from the body, extraction from the land, extraction of labor. That got me to thinking about that, and I connect other stories with stories of work during the COVID pandemic. And extraction is a key theme when we think about the climate crisis, because it is the extraction of natural resources to the breaking point of the planet, which has led us to the climate crisis today. And unless we stop thinking about the planet as something to be extracted from, and the lives of people in the global south being objects to be used and extracted from, then the planet will collapse. But we know that. So this key theme of extraction was very much informed from the workshops with Nicole, from working with participants, and through gardening and learning how to garden together.
How has gardening contributed to this practice? I'd like to know that.
Yeah, I wrote Family Tree, which was originally commissioned by a company called Actors Touring Company, and I came up with the idea with a director called Matthai, so I should just mention him. And it was during the COVID pandemic, and there were very few things one could do. And so Nicole and I got into gardening. We got into gardening outside, but in a community garden. We don't have a garden. So in Berlin, where we live, there are community gardens. And I started seeing all kinds of images and imaginings as I was ripping up concrete and planting. And it weaves its way in poetically very much through the text in the play. Because the play itself is set in a garden. It's set in a garden which is also a cemetery. In Berlin, there's this practice of using old cemeteries to garden. Not into the soil, but using raised beds and planting, because there are many cemeteries in Berlin that are no longer used. And it sounds kind of like a strange idea to use a cemetery to garden, but I was very fixated with this idea, which is spoken about in a film by Jumana Manna, which talks about burial into the soil as an early form of gardening. that we tend the body, that we tend the garden where the body is laid or the ashes are laid. And so I was very fixated with this idea. So the play family tree is set in a garden which is a bit like a cemetery, which is like we were gardening in during the pandemic. And Henrietta Lacks is wandering through this garden trying to figure out where she is. So that's how it all interconnects. It's pretty layered, I guess so's life.
So what interests me even further is we have seen colonialism or forms of oppression and climate change. We have been accustomed to see these two things as two distinct entities and rarely interconnected, right? And like now we find about this ripple effect where one thing is impacting another, right? And there is a relationality between oppression of other kind and how it is ending up depleting the nature itself. So at the end of this oppression diet, it's probably the nature and the people connected with the nature, right? So what came first in this quest? The aspect of climate change or the aspect of oppression, and what led to the other thing?
For me, they're all interconnected. They're about also a mentality that one can exploit the planet and human bodies and species. Coming from Europe, from Northern Europe, but not just Northern Europe, from Europe, the idea that you can just go on and on extracting labour, bodies, minerals, which we know is directly linked to the climate crisis, extraction of oil, the use of oils and plastics, etc. So they may seem like disparate subjects, but they're totally together, and unless we look at colonialism and the legacies and interconnections of colonialism and casteism, all those things, and racism, unless we look at those things together, we won't find solutions, and the poorest on the planet will suffer the most. So even today in one of the workshops, for example, I'm learning so much here. I've learned so much from talking with you, and I've learned so much from even just listening to the participants today. So the caste system here is supported by the colonial system, as I've learned today. The caste system here predates colonialism, but for sure, the bearers of my passport, a British passport, totally supported the caste system that worked for them and reinforced and undermined that horrendous system. So if you have today a situation where somebody is only permitted and allowed and expected to work in one particular profession because of their caste, and if they can no longer do that profession, which is a student taught me this today. If somebody can no longer do that, if they must be a fisherman and they can no longer fish, or the waters are polluted and they're not expected or permitted or trained to do anything else, then that person will be the first person to go hungry. We know this. I don't need to teach anybody this. This is what I'm learning from being here. I'm no teacher of this. I'm a learner, processing what I'm learning. But all of those things are connected. And ultimately, the darker skinned peoples of the planet suffer the most. And that has to change. So we have to address racism, casteism, colonialism together. And it's a big task. But we can start with our own lives, and the way I start is through art. The way I communicate that is through theatre, because that's what I know.
Right in the base of this play is the concept of extraction, right? Extraction from nature, extraction from natural resources, extraction by using humans as capitals. You see, while studying economics, something that really baffled me was we have this production function, which is, so output is a function of land, labor, capital, and human capital. So human is basically seen as a capital, a means of production, right? Not all humans, certain humans, right? And the structure of oppression is such that this certain humans is the majority of people, right? And the circle of the oppressor gets lesser and lesser, and it finds newer ways to, it gets strengthened, although it gets lessened, but it gets strengthened, right? With the oppressor finds ways of oppressing within their own, let's say, race or community, right? This structure of oppression is so. So treating humans as capitals or means for production. So if that capital is able to produce the surplus, then it's considered to be a good capital. In case it is not, then it's considered to be a redundant capital and to be get done with. And the system is such that there will be a deep sense of resentment towards self in that person, themselves or self, himself. The system has been aligned in such a way. So it has its shackles deeply embedded, right, in our body, in our existence and everything. So where do you see practices like this, practices like ours, going towards in intervention, in creating intervention, and is there a better future?
A better future, I can't say. You know, I feel like there's regression happening at the moment. I don't think things are improving. But I think art, certainly in theatre, which is the only art form I practice, I really know about, is a practice that enables us, in Boal's terms, to see what we look at, to listen to what we hear, to feel what we touch, to notice, to really observe with all senses. And one can't interact unless one observes in theatre. You have to notice, you have to see, you have to listen, and then make. And that principle of observing and interacting is core to principles of agroecology, permaculture, indigenous ecologies. To notice what's happening in nature and before one interacts with it, and to do that in theatre as well. And so theatre is a kind of, for me, a kind of awakening and an alertness to what is going on in the world, to ask difficult questions, to ask that of oneself and to ask that in a theatre space. So I think that's what theatre can do. It can get us asking questions and noticing how things are in the world, in particular power dynamics. Because unless you notice, you'll never be able to change it. Yeah.
So noticing yourself and also in relationality with everything that's happening.
Yeah.
And then so performance becomes a tool for that. Performance becomes a tool for noticing yourself and the relationality.
Yeah.
So Boal also went forward in defining the aesthetics of the oppressed, right? He had to do that, to define an aesthetics of the oppressed, because it's not elitist. It's away from the elitist notions of aesthetics. How do you define the aesthetic principles of your art, or of your intervention, of your interventive art?
I mean, I think I'm learning a lot from, and I don't know whether I'm applying this in full yet in my work, but something came up today in the workshop which really struck me, and Nicole was talking about the forest, and that the forest produces no waste. But there's no concept of waste when we think about the forest. And the work that we're doing in this kind of agroecological work is about learning from the forest and using theatre to learn about the forest and then applying that to gardening, growing, whether it be on a balcony or on a farm or in our lives. So I wonder about working towards a kind of theatre that imitates the forest, that is multi-layered and produces no waste. I'm very far away from that in my practice and my work, but that's what I want to get to.
So literally and metaphorically, it produces no waste.
Yeah.
So how do you define waste in metaphorically?
I don't know about metaphorically, but I mean, in terms of waste, not wasting time, not wasting the audience's time. I hate it when I go to the theatre. I spend 2 hours and I think I will never get that time back. You know, that time is wasted. I'll be an old person lying on my deathbed wondering where those 2 hours went. I've seen so many shows. So not wasting the audience's time, getting to the point, asking the questions you want to ask with the audience, with each other as creators, not producing literal waste in terms of the making of a show, reusing everything that we have, looking at what we have for free, looking at what's on offer, you know, looking at the ideas that are being offered by a particular moment and working with them, seeing everything as an opportunity to be used. The forest is opportunity, it uses everything, you know. So somehow bringing that thinking to my practice, whether it just be concepts or materials or people, you know, and that people shouldn't be wasted either. You know, that François Verger, this wonderful post-colonial feminist scholar, talks about human beings that have been treated as cheap objects. And she talks about not that we're not in an Anthropocene, but we're in a racial capitalocene. It's kind of a complicated phrase, but I'm interested in that we shouldn't be wasting people either. And humans waste humans, and that has to stop. Exploitation has to stop. And all we can do is to do that in our work. It's not about grand ideas and talking about it, it's about doing that in your own work and doing your best in your own work with others.
That sounds so laudable, at the same time it sounds so simple also. Like being able to do this, or being able to practice this, it sounds so simple. So I have these concluding questions. How is your work related to the, how is your work, of course it's complemented by the bowl and fairy nexus, but how at the same time it's a departure from it as well? And is it?
I think my work is perhaps a departure from the idea of Boal and Freire being the nexus. It's the white men get remembered. The people of colour, the low-caste people, the dark-skinned people, the women get forgotten in history, you know. Like the African proverb is probably in India as well, the tales of the hunter only, the tales of the lion only remember the hunter, was all about, I'm misusing it, but you know, but the so-called marginalised get forgotten in the telling of the story. So Boal was, in Indian terms, a guru. You know, Boal was a great teacher and somebody I loved very much. But he only made what he made in working in relationship with indigenous people, black people, working class people. His work, Forum Theatre, for example, you could say it was invented by an African Peruvian woman who thought what Boal was doing was fundamentally problematic. And she got up and said she's leaving the theatre, and he said, please don't go, stop, wait. He used to tell the story all the time. And then she got up and she went onto the stage. And that was the first Forum Theatre kind of intervention. One could say that she invented it. She invented Forum Theatre as much as Boal did. So this idea of, we're sitting in a room, an economics room, and every picture on the wall is of a white person, and most of them are men. In India, come on, decolonize our minds, you know, that we put white people, and in particular white men, on, and high-class men and high-class men on pedestals. We don't have to do that. We don't have to call it, or think of it as the nexus of Boal and Freire. It doesn't mean that we don't honour them, but we remember that those works and those ideas were only ever made in collaboration. We forget those other names, and we do this very Christian colonial thing of putting some people on an altar. So it's informed by them, but it's informed by every participant I met today. It's informed by our conversation today. I've learned a lot from you today. You know, I mean that. I learned from you, I learned from Boal, I learned from the participants in the workshop. So it's not so much a departure, but an integration of many, many forms of knowledge. Especially with things like agroecology, We draw from so-called permaculture, but we try not to use that word because permaculture has been named by white Australian men who basically spent their time observing how indigenous people in Australia were growing and living, formalizing that, calling it permaculture, writing the books and selling expensive training courses that most indigenous Australians would never be able to afford, but they invented it. I'm sick of that way of thinking and educating ourselves. And also life is too short for that. We've got a climate crisis going on. We're going to need to stop putting people on pedestals, whether it be Augusta Boal or Greta Thunberg. I love them both, but take them down off the altar and start working with the people at grassroots level, and we can learn how to get ourselves out of this mess.
So finally, I'd like to ask you that how do your principles, your findings, and your theories, which have a global foundation, but also into the fact that there is a heterogeneity globally, right? How can this be adapted and practiced and live with the heterogeneity, but also looking at the nature of oppression, which is prevalent?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think the main thing for me as a teacher and learner is to respond to who is in the workshop themselves, and to share a particular technique, and to also then see how that works for them, and to exchange together, and to think of it more of an exchange rather than I'm downloading some tools that other people can use. Otherwise, it's not real and not useful. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for imparting such valuable thoughts, and thanks a lot for doing what a lot of us should do, and what the entire world should engage in right now. The immediate crisis is high time, I believe. So, thank you.
Thank you, Devashish. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.